Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're floating into one of those corners of history where you just shake your head and think, wow, humanity really doubled down on the bad ideas, didn't it? So, get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe even grab a blanket. Because tonight's bedtime story is about the charming little tradition where widows, or more accurately, women who happen to be married to powerful men, were expected to be mummified alive. Yes, literally sealed up, preserved, and sent off into the afterlife alongside their husbands. Because apparently, death wasn't dramatic enough unless you dragged your wife into it too. Now, if you've ever thought marriage was a long-term commitment, well, some cultures really took that whole till death do us part thing and said, nope, death is just the beginning. The practice we're talking about tonight mostly shows up in royal courts of Central Asia and India, with variations in other places. One of the most infamous versions is sati, the ritual where a widow would throw herself or be thrown onto her husband's funeral pyre. But in some regions, especially among Mongol and Turkic elites, there was this even stranger, quieter variation. The wives were entombed alive with their royal husbands. No fire, just the slow, stuffy eternity of being buried in a sealed chamber. Now let's picture this. The great Khan or nobleman dies, probably from gout, battle wounds, or just existing on a medieval diet of fatty meats and suspiciously unwashed wine goblets. And instead of the palace collectively sighing in relief, the attendants start preparing his tomb. The catch? His wives, concubines, and sometimes even servants were expected to climb in with him, alive, breathing, and then stay there forever. Because, of course, it wasn't enough for the king to own everything in life. He had to own people in death too. Romantic, isn't it? One of the more infamous examples comes from the Mongol world. When Genghis Khan's descendants were laying down their empire, funerary customs became this elaborate ordeal. We don't know exactly how many wives and attendants got the mummified alive treatment, but accounts from travelers and chroniclers describe royal burials where living women were sealed inside the tomb chamber with food, water, and whatever luxury goods were lying around. The idea was they'd serve him in the afterlife. Though, of course, the practicality of surviving in a stone room underground isn't exactly promising. Let's just say, these weren't long retirements. And here's the thing, a lot of these women didn't exactly get a choice in the matter. Sure, the official story was always about devotion and honor. But realistically, it's hard to imagine someone saying, yes, please, lock me in a stone closet with my dead husband. Sounds lovely. More often, it was family pressure, political expectation, and sometimes literal force. In India, the sati version of this got more attention from Europeans later on, because nothing shocks a visiting colonizer more than local customs they don't understand. But for centuries, among warrior elites, it was considered the height of loyalty. A widow was meant to follow her husband into death, as though she were his favorite accessory. Not diamonds, not a crown, just a breathing, burning person. There are even chilling accounts of noblewomen who tried to resist. Sometimes, soldiers were stationed to make sure the ritual went smoothly. Imagine being nudged toward a funeral pyre or tomb, while men in armor stood around to encourage you. Not exactly voluntary. But let's glide back to our mummified wives. The burial practices of the Mongols and Turkic peoples often included live servants too. Because why stop at your spouse when you can drag the whole household with you? Horses, guards, musicians. Basically, if you were unlucky enough to be too close to the boss, you might end up immortalized in a stone chamber against your will. And it wasn't just the steppe nomads. Ancient China had similar traditions during the Shang dynasty, where royal tombs contained rows of skeletons, wives, concubines, and servants who had been sacrificed or buried alive. Historians like to dress it up in academic language, but let's be honest. It was the world's bleakest office party, where the only perk was never having to clock in again. The irony, of course, is that these kings and khans wanted eternal company, but what they really created were mass graves dressed up as luxury mausoleums. A few jade trinkets, some wine jars, and then dozens of terrified people waiting for the air to run out. But hey, at least it shows the universal royal theme, insecurity. Even in death, these rulers couldn't be alone. So, as you're lying there getting comfortable, maybe thinking about your own relationships, be glad you weren't married off to a Mongol Khan or a medieval Indian prince. Because chances are, you wouldn't just be worrying about whose turn it was to do the laundry. You'd be worrying whether you'd end up sealed in stone or set on fire. All in the name of eternal love. Let's drift a little further, because the story doesn't end there. Different regions had their own spin on the idea. Some were harsher, some, let's say, slightly less awful. But for now, just imagine the scene. The flickering torchlight, the stone steps leading down into the tomb, the heavy slabs rolling shut, and the silence, as history's strangest honeymoon suite gets sealed forever. Alright, let's gently drift deeper into this historical rabbit hole. Because, of course, one vague description of royal wives being locked in tombs isn't enough for us tonight. We need specifics, names, faces, the poor women who went down in history not for what they did, but for who they married. Let's start with one of the biggest culprits. The Mongol elites. When the great Khans died, they expected company. Take Ogidi Khan, one of Genghis Khan's sons. Now, Ogidi himself didn't live the most responsible lifestyle. Think endless drinking, feasting, and then, unsurprisingly, dying in his 40s. But at his funeral, accounts mention that not only treasures and horses were sealed with him, but also women. His wives and concubines were expected to follow him underground. Imagine being told your husband's hobby of winebenders is now your full-time afterlife gig. And it wasn't just him. Reports of Mongol royal burials mention dozens of people, sometimes up to 50, shut inside with the deceased ruler. The logic was painfully simple. A king in life must remain a king in death. And a king without servants? Well, apparently that was just too undignified to consider. Now, if you're thinking, surely this was rare. Not really. Over in ancient China, during the Shang dynasty, royal tombs show exactly the same thing. Excavations at Inshu, the last Shang capital, revealed mass graves of wives and concubines carefully arranged around the king's burial chamber. Some had signs of strangulation or poison, suggesting they were helped along to the afterlife. Others, well, they were simply buried alive. And here's where it gets surreal. The Chinese practice eventually evolved into what they called Mingqi, burying symbolic figurines instead of real people. Clay servants, clay animals, clay wives, which honestly is the sensible compromise. If you really need staff in the afterlife, why not go for pottery instead of murder? But, as with most reforms, it took centuries of live burials before someone finally said, maybe we don't need actual human beings in the hole. Meanwhile, let's float over to India, where the infamous practice of sati fits into this broader theme. Technically, it wasn't mummification, but it carried the same idea. A woman proving her devotion by dying alongside her husband. Some queens did it willingly, or at least history tells us they did. Others, well, let's just say voluntary becomes suspicious when you've got armed guards standing nearby. One famous example is Rani Padmavati of Chittor, who, according to legend, committed jauhar, a mass form of sati, along with thousands of other women, rather than be captured after their men were defeated. It's always framed as this noble, tragic act. But if you think about it in real-world terms, it was just one more way women were forced into death because their lives weren't considered worth separating from their husbands. And it wasn't limited to Asia. Even in parts of Europe, echoes of this show up. Among the early Scythians and Thracians, for example, kings were buried with wives, concubines, and horses. The Greek historian Herodotus, never one to skip a juicy detail, casually mentions that Scythian kings were buried with one of their wives and several servants, all strangled to join him underground. Strangled because apparently that was the polite option. But back to the mummified alive angle. One of the most haunting records comes from Central Asia. When a Turkic chieftain died, his primary wife was sealed with him, along with food and drink to sustain her, as though anyone truly believed a woman could just snack her way through eternity in a sealed stone box. It was less eternal feast, more eternal claustrophobia. And the strangest part? These practices weren't considered barbaric by their own societies. They were normal, expected, praised. A woman who refused would bring shame on her family, while one who went willingly was praised as the ideal wife. Imagine your entire worth as a person being measured by how gracefully you agreed to be locked in with a corpse. The ironic contrast is hard to miss. These rulers had absolute power in life, yet they were so afraid of death's loneliness that they needed an entourage to cushion the blow. Powerful emperors, mighty warlords, fierce kings, all revealed, in the end, as just lonely men who couldn't bear to face eternity by themselves. So, next time someone romanticizes the idea of true devotion, maybe remember these women, because sometimes devotion wasn't flowers and poetry. Sometimes it was just a very dark room, sealed shut, with no exit. And with that, let's drift further, because we've still got a few more eerie royal traditions waiting for us. The mummified wives were just one chapter. Humanity, as always, found plenty of ways to make death just a little weirder.
So, by now you're probably wondering, how long did all of this last? Surely, people came to their senses eventually. And yes, though, as with most bad traditions, it took far too long. Let's float first into the medieval and early modern world. By this time, in places like China, the whole burying wives alive trend had thankfully been toned down. Rulers started favoring symbolic objects, or in some cases, just very elaborate tomb paintings. Because clay figurines don't complain, and painted servants don't need air. A sensible upgrade. But in India, sati stubbornly clung on, especially among certain warrior castes and royal families. For many centuries, it was dressed up as the ultimate form of wifely devotion. European travelers in the 16th and 17th centuries were horrified by what they saw, and of course, they wrote long, judgmental accounts about it, conveniently ignoring all the weird and cruel traditions back home. Because hypocrisy is the one tradition every culture seems to share. Take the British colonial period. By the 1800s, the East India Company was well established, and British officials kept wringing their hands over sati. Some of them genuinely thought it was barbaric. Others just used it as an excuse to claim moral superiority. They published reports describing widows being tied to pyres, guarded so they couldn't escape. And they pointed to it as proof that India needed the civilizing hand of colonial rule. Which is, of course, ironic, given the British were also busy looting temples and starting famines. Eventually, reformers from within India itself, like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, began openly criticizing the practice, pointing out what everyone knew. Most women didn't volunteer, they were pressured or outright forced. In 1829, under Governor-General Lord William Bentinck, sati was officially banned in British India. On paper, anyway. Like most bans, it didn't vanish overnight. But at least it marked a turning point where widows weren't automatically expected to throw themselves into the flames. Meanwhile, in Central Asia and the steppe world, the live-entombment practice faded much earlier, as Islam spread and reshaped funerary traditions. Islamic burial customs were simpler, and honestly much kinder. No giant tomb chambers full of servants and concubines. Just a body, a prayer, and the earth. Compared to being sealed underground with 50 panicked people, it probably felt refreshingly peaceful. Still, echoes of these customs lingered in local folklore. Stories of royal tombs with mysterious skeletons, or of women praised for their devotion in following their husbands into the grave. They became cautionary tales, half legend, half history. And here's the quiet tragedy of it all. For most of these women, we don't even know their names. The kings and khans, the emperors and princes, they're remembered in chronicles and stone inscriptions. But the wives, they fade into the margins, recorded only as the consort who followed him in death. History reduces them to props, even though they were living, breathing people with their own hopes, fears, and probably a very strong opinion about being shoved into a tomb. The strangest part is how normal it seemed at the time. Imagine a wedding day where, instead of just worrying about whether your in-laws liked you, you also had to think, if he dies first, am I going into the ground with him? Not exactly the fairy tale ending. And yet, that was the expectation. Across cultures, across centuries, women's lives were tied so tightly to their husbands that even death wasn't an escape. Loyalty, devotion, obedience. It all got twisted into a demand for sacrifice. Sometimes fiery, sometimes silent and stone cold. So tonight, as we close the tomb door on this topic, let's take one last look. Picture the ancient mausoleum, the heavy slabs, the rows of treasures meant to last an eternity. And there, in the shadows, the silent company of wives who never asked for this role. It's a sobering reminder that history isn't just kings and battles. It's also the quiet, forgotten tragedies, the people buried alongside the powerful, not because of what they did, but because of who they were attached to. And with that thought, let's drift off. Because fortunately, the only thing you need to be buried under tonight is your blanket. Good night, everyone.